Good afternoon, church. Here we are in our final devotional of the week. We've talked about our calling, we addressed some of our excuses for not fulfilling our call, and we've seen how God can take our broken and messed up lives, our brokenness, and He can make something beautiful out of it. Today, I want to talk about why we should share our Kintsugi stories. In 2 Corinthians, Paul states that we are like fragile jars of clay containing this great treasure. The more I read this letter, the more I see the principles of Kintsugi shining through. Let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 through 11, and I'll be reading from the New Living Translation. We think you ought to know, dear brothers and sisters, about the trouble we went through in the province of Asia. We were crushed and overwhelmed beyond our ability to endure, and we thought we would never live through it. In fact, we expected to die. But as a result, we stopped relying on ourselves and learned to rely only on God, who raises the dead. And He did rescue us from mortal danger, and He will rescue us again. We have placed our confidence in Him, and we will continue to rescue, that He will continue to rescue us. And you are helping us by praying for us. Then many people will give thanks because God has graciously answered so many prayers for our safety. Here, Paul is brutally honest about his struggles. He doesn't try to maintain an image as a perfect Christian or a successful missionary. He is open about just how difficult it has been for him and Timothy. They were pushed to their limits to the point where they expected to die. He acknowledges just how broken they were. Why is he so open about his story? And what are the benefits in us sharing our stories of brokenness? Well, let's look first at why Paul is not doing it. He's not doing it for pity. He's not doing it to use his suffering as an excuse to stop serving. And he's not doing it looking for praise for all that he has overcome. His motivation is to point to God, to testify that at the point of death, he learned to rely on a greater power than his own, the God who has the ability to raise the dead. As he shares of God's rescue in the past, he expresses his confidence that God will do it again in the present, and he puts his hope in God for the future. Finally, he encourages the Corinthians, thanking them for their prayers and exhorting them to praise God because their prayers have been answered. It's all about pointing to God and not to himself. I think this is helpful for us to consider. Obviously, there are times when we just need to talk as therapy for ourselves. We need to get our story and our pain out in the open in order to process it, whether it's with a trained counselor or with a friend or a family member. That is important for our healing. Here, though, I want to focus on how we share our story when we're a bit further on in the healing process, and when our hope in sharing our story would be to encourage others. It's important to be authentic about our brokenness and God's healing. But it's also important to think about how we do that well. And Paul's attitude is a great example. Here's a few points that you will find helpful in sharing your story. First of all, we are not the main character. It can be easy to cast ourselves in the role of the hero of the story or sometimes the villain, but we're neither. In fact, God is the central character, and our little stories are a part of His big story. So that is where the focus should be. Next, we should consider others who play a part in our stories and how we represent them, as well as being mindful of those who are hearing or possibly reading our stories. What impact will it have on them, and how will this affect the way that we tell it? Next, honor and value your story of how God sought you and redeemed you. Every story is unique. Every story is valuable. And then the gospel. The gospel means that we can tell our stories and not be ashamed. God can bring glory to Himself through our stories. If we keep our focus on God, then our stories can be just as powerful as Paul's, testifying of God's healing and restoration, His power to rescue, and His presence in the midst of challenges. As people relate to our brokenness, but then they hear testimony of how God has woven His golden threads of healing through our messy stories, the result is hope for the future and God being glorified. It's my hope and prayer that you have found courage and are encouraged to go and share the good news and your story of redemption, your Kintsugi story in God's bigger story, and make Christ-like disciples. God bless you.